Get your mop and get out of this boardroom, sweetheart. Adults are working. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She stood there in her gray uniform with her hands folded in front of her, and she looked at him the way a woman looks at something she has already seen the end of. I said, get out. She took one slow step backward toward the door, and then she stopped, because on the whiteboard behind him, the massive, floor-to-soiling whiteboard covered in equations and failure, and 3 weeks of a company's desperate math, she had seen something. Something small. Something that changed everything. She had no idea what was about to happen to him. But in 40 seconds, Marcus Hale, CEO of Hale Meridian Capital, was going to make the most expensive mistake of his life. Have you ever been dismissed so completely that the person dismissing you didn't even bother to learn your name? Let me take you back. 14 hours earlier, the Meridian building touched the sky at 47 floors, all glass and steel, and the particular arrogance of new money that has learned to dress like old money. It sat in the financial district of Charlotte, North Carolina, the kind of building that made the people inside it feel significant just by proximity. The lobby alone cost more to build than most people would earn in 3 lifetimes. The cleaning crew arrived at 45 every morning before any of that significance woke up, and they were gone, invisible, before the elevators started filling. Dorothy Sims arrived at 4:43. She always arrived 2 minutes early. It was a habit her mother had given her. The same way her mother had given her the small gold brooch she pinned every single morning to the inside of her uniform collar, hidden, always hidden, pressed against her collarbone where she could feel it when she breathed. The brooch was old, small and oval and gold, with a ring of tiny seed pearls around the edge and a set of initials engraved in the center. The letters were worn smooth from years of handling. D.A.S. Dorothy Ann Sims, yes, but also something else. Something she had never told anyone at Meridian, because no one at Meridian had ever thought to ask her a single thing about herself. She was 61 years old. She had worked the upper floors of this building for 9 years. She knew which partners drank too much at the holiday party and which ones left the kindest tip at Christmas in the little envelope slipped under the supply closet door. She knew the building the way a doctor knows a body, every system, every rhythm, every place where something could quietly go wrong. She pushed her cart off the service elevator on 38 and began her rounds. Floor 38 was the quantitative strategy division. That was the polite name for it. What it actually was the place where Marcus Hale had bet $23 million of investor capital on a proprietary pricing algorithm that was supposed to revolutionize the way the firm hedged its commodity exposure. The algorithm had a name. They called it ARIA, Adaptive Risk Intelligence Architecture. They had been building it for 2 years. They had launched it 4 months ago, and for 4 months it had been slowly, quietly, and then not so quietly hemorrhaging money in ways that none of the 12 analysts and 3 senior partners assigned to it could explain. Dorothy had been cleaning that floor for 9 years. She had watched the whiteboards fill and empty and fill again. She had watched the coffee cups multiply during crunch weeks and the posture of the young analysts curve lower and lower under the weight of a problem nobody could crack. She had learned, over 9 years of invisible presence in rooms where smart people spoke freely, to understand quite a lot about what was written on those boards. She didn't tell anyone that either. She mopped in long, even strokes, working around the edges of the room toward the center, the way her mother had taught her. Her mother had been a woman who believed that the way you did the small things was the way you did everything. You didn't cut corners on a floor. You didn't cut corners on a proof. You didn't cut corners on a life. Her mother's name had been Dr. Adeline Sims, the second S in DAS doctor. Adeline Sims had been, in the years between 1971 and 2003, one of the most quietly consequential applied mathematicians in the southeastern United States. She had never been famous. She had never been on the cover of anything. She had published in journals that the people on floor 38 would have recognized instantly, under a name they would not have connected to the woman who mopped their floors at 5 in the morning. She had taught for 22 years at a small, historically black college 40 minutes outside Charlotte, in a classroom with a water stain on the ceiling and 27 students who adored her. She had died of a stroke in the spring of 2003, leaving behind her daughter, her notebooks, her teaching, and a brooch. Dorothy had inherited all of it. She had inherited the notebooks most of all. She had grown up at that kitchen table, doing homework, while her mother graded papers, listening to her mother think out loud about problems. She had absorbed the cadence of that thinking the way children absorb language, not as instruction, but as atmosphere. She had gone to college on a partial scholarship and graduated with a degree in mathematics that she had quietly stopped telling people about. Somewhere around year 3 of cleaning buildings, because it made conversations uncomfortable in a way she had learned to avoid. She was not bitter about this. She had made peace with the shape of her life, the way you make peace with weather. You dress for it. You move through it. You carry the things that matter close to your body. She carried the brooch. She carried her mother's voice. And on the morning of March the 14th, she carried her mop onto floor 38 at 4:43 in the morning and began, as she always did, her quiet, invisible rounds. That was when she saw it. She had seen the aria board before. They never erased it fully, just layered new work on top of old failed attempts, so it had become almost geological over the months, strata of dead ends. But there was new work on it this morning. Someone had been there until very late. She could tell by the number of coffee cups, and they had made progress, real progress. The structure of the core volatility model was clean in a way it hadn't been before, and there, embedded in the third line of the variance decomposition, was a mistake so simple it was almost beautiful. She stopped mopping. She stood in front of the board for exactly long enough to confirm what she was seeing. She has done this math. Not this exact math, but the underlying logic was her mother's logic, the same logic she had watched built from scratch at a kitchen table in 1986, when she was 21 years old, and her mother was working through a paper on systemic error propagation in iterative models. The sign was wrong. One sign, in one term, and it was contaminating every downstream calculation, like a single wrong note played at the beginning of a long song. She stood there. She thought about saying something. She thought about it the way you think about a door you have walked past 10,000 times, without opening. She thought about what her mother would say. She thought about the brooch pressing against her collarbone. She picked up her mop. She pushed her cart to the next section. She finished her floor. She did not say anything. Not yet. Marcus Hale arrived at 7:58. He was 44 years old, the kind of 44 that involved a personal trainer and a clothing budget that would fund a small nonprofit. He had founded Hale Meridian at 31 with family money, a Harvard MBA, and the absolute, unshakable conviction that he was the smartest person in any room he walked into. He had been right often enough that no one around him had been adequately positioned to tell him when he was wrong. He was having a terrible month. The ARIA losses were not yet public, but they would be. The quarterly report was in 11 days. The investor call was in 14. He had his 3 best quant analysts, 2 outside consultants, and a $40,000 a week crisis firm from New York, all working the problem, and none of them had solved it. And his face in the elevator mirror every morning was the face of a man who was beginning to understand what exposure felt like. He got off on 38 at 8:02. He walked past the cleaning cart without seeing it. He did not see the woman pushing it either, not in any meaningful sense. She was furniture. She was infrastructure. She was the invisible mechanism by which the carpet remained clean, and the whiteboard ledge remained chalk-free, and the coffee station remained stocked. He walked to the main strategy room. He stood in front of the board. He stared at it. He pulled out his phone. He called his head of quant strategy. He said the same thing he had said every morning for 6 weeks. "Tell me you have something." The voice on the phone said what it had said every morning for 6 weeks. Marcus Hale turned around, and Dorothy Sims was in the doorway. She had come back. She had come back because she had stood in the service corridor for 4 minutes, and she had thought about her mother, and about the notebooks, and about the fact that she had watched this floor suffer with a problem she could see the answer to, and something in her, something old and trained and her mother's daughter, would not let her walk past it again. "Excuse me," she said, quietly. "I'm sorry to interrupt." He looked at her the way he looked at the cleaning cart. "You're not supposed to be in here during business hours. I know, I apologize. I just wanted to—" What did you want?" She looked at the board. She looked at him. She said carefully, "I think there might be an error in the variance model." In the third line, the silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight. Marcus Hale looked at her. He looked at her uniform. He looked at her cart in the doorway. He looked at her the way some people look at a thing that has stepped outside its designated category and made them momentarily uncomfortable. And then he laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh right away. It started as genuine amusement. The absurdity of it to him, the cleaning woman interrupting the crisis meeting to offer mathematical input. But it curdled quickly, because there were two junior analysts in the room, and performing certainty in front of your people is a reflex when you're a man like Marcus Hale. "An error," he said. "Yes, there's in the sign convention on the— Do you know what ARIA is? I understand the general structure of the— Do you have a degree in quantitative finance? In mathematics? In anything that would make your opinion on my proprietary algorithm relevant in any way?" She was quiet. She was still. She did not raise her voice. She did not move from the doorway. He took 3 steps toward her. "Get your mop and get out of this boardroom, sweetheart. Adults are working." And this was the thing. This was the thing that people would talk about afterward, that would appear in every article and every comment thread and every retelling of this story. He reached out, and he took the whiteboard eraser from the ledge, and he looked her in the eye, and he erased the third line. He erased it slowly. He erased it the way you erase something to make a point. Then he set the eraser down, and he turned back to his board, and he said, to the room, to no one, to the air, "Someone get her out of here." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. She reached up to her collar. Her fingers found the brooch through the fabric of her uniform. She pressed it once, gently, like a prayer. "Yes, sir," she said. She took her cart. She walked to the service elevator. The doors closed. She did not cry. She had not cried in a long time over things like this, but she stood in the service elevator as it descended, and she let herself feel the familiar weight of it, the particular exhaustion of being dismissed before you're heard, and she made a decision. What happened next would make the front page of 3 financial publications and trend nationally for 4 days. She took her lunch break at noon. She sat in the break room on the maintenance level with a brown paper bag and her mother's notebook. She always brought one notebook. She kept them in rotation, reading through them the way some people read devotion. And she sat with the third line of the ARIA variance model in her mind, and she wrote out the correction on a paper napkin. And she looked at it for a while, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about a woman who had spent 30 years being the right person in the wrong room. There was a man named Gerald Park who worked in building management. He had worked with Dorothy for 6 years. He had a son who was a graduate student in applied mathematics at Duke, and he had once spent an entire lunch break listening to Dorothy talk through a problem the boy was having with a proof, after which he had called his son and said, verbatim, "I work with someone you need to meet." His son had said, respectfully, "Sure, Dad." But Gerald Park had not forgotten. Gerald Park knocked on the break room door at 12:15. She told him what she'd seen, all of it. The sign error, the downstream contamination, what she believed the correction would do to the model's output. She wrote it on the back of the napkin, and she showed him. Gerald Park had a cousin who worked in financial compliance. Gerald Park's cousin had a colleague who had filed a quiet whistleblower concern about ARIA-related trades 6 weeks ago, concern that hadn't been acted upon, that was sitting in a regulatory inbox, that had been waiting for something that looked like evidence. Gerald Park took a picture of the napkin. He did not upload it yet. He showed it to his cousin. His cousin showed it to her colleague. Her colleague made a call to the SEC office in Charlotte. The SEC officer who answered asked one question: "Is there a person who can demonstrate this in real time?" Gerald Park had one call to make. At 2:47 in the afternoon, Dorothy Sims received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered it in the parking garage, standing beside her 15-year-old Honda. She listened for 3 minutes. She said, "When?" The voice said 40 minutes. Dorothy said. Give me 30 to get changed. She went back to the building in different clothes. She had a blazer in her locker. She kept it there from a time when she had briefly tried to take evening classes at the community college before the schedule had made it impossible, and she had never taken it home. Navy blue. Careful. The brooch moved from inside her uniform collar to the lapel of the blazer. There it was, DAS, small and gold and pearl ringed and worn smooth. She went up on the main elevator. The lobby security guard, not the morning crew who knew her, saw a woman in a navy blazer with a gold brooch and a careful expression and held the elevator. She pressed 38. What Dorothy did not know, and what Marcus Hale most certainly did not know, was that 11 days before the quarterly report, the regulatory concern Gerald's cousin's colleague had been assigned to a 3-person SEC review team in Charlotte, and that review team had been trying for 2 weeks to find a technical expert who could evaluate the ARIA model's architecture under a time constraint. The team had, as of that morning, failed to find one. Quantitative strategy experts at this level of specificity were expensive, slow, and already retained by the firms they were most qualified to evaluate. The napkin photo had changed that calculation. The 3-member team arrived at the Meridian lobby at 3:17. They had a temporary access order. They had their credentials. They had a letter, and they had Dorothy Sims, who walked in with them and did not look at the lobby's marble floors, which she had mopped 300 times, but kept her eyes level and her pace steady in her hand, just slightly over the brooch on her lapel. Marcus Hale was in the strategy room on 38. His New York crisis consultants were there. His head of quant strategy was there. There were papers everywhere, and the smell of fear that expensive coffee cannot fully mask. The door opened. His assistant stepped in, gray-faced. Mr. Hale, there are people here from the 3 SEC officers walked in, and behind them, in a navy blazer, was the cleaning woman. The room went still. Marcus Hale looked at her. He looked at the badge on the lead officer's belt. He looked back at her. Something crossed his face. Not recognition, not yet, but the beginning of a shape he didn't like. What is this? He said. It wasn't a question. The lead officer said, Mr. Hale, we have a temporary review access order relating to the ARIA model's variance architecture. We have a technical evaluator with us. We'd like to use the board. Marcus Hale said, she is a cleaning woman. The lead officer said, Sir, she is our technical evaluator. If you'd like to see her credentials, we can do that. Or we can proceed. Your legal team will want this to go quickly. One of the crisis consultants was already on his phone, stepping toward the corner, whispering. Marcus Hale looked at Dorothy Sims. He looked at her blazer. He looked at the brooch. He looked at the way she was standing, still, careful, exactly as calm as she had been in the doorway at 8 in the morning. And something in him, not wisdom, not yet, but the first cold edge of something, began to move. He said at half the volume he'd been using, Fine. Dorothy stepped to the board. She asked for a marker. Someone handed her one. She looked at the board for approximately 4 seconds. She found the third line. She corrected it. 1 sign, 1 mark. Less than 40 seconds, start to finish. Then she stepped back. The head of quant strategy, a man named Elliot Reese, who had been a finalist for a Fields Medal in a different life, and who was one of the few genuine geniuses in the room, stared at the board. He stared at it for a long time. The color left his face slowly, like water draining. He said, very quietly, Oh my God, he said it the way you say it when you've been looking at something for 3 months. And the answer was there the whole time in a form you didn't have the language to see. Marcus Hale looked at Elliot Reese. He looked at the board. He looked at Dorothy Sims. He said, That's, Elliot Reese said, that's it. That's the error. That's, all of it comes from that. The room did not make a sound. Marcus Hale's face went white, not figuratively, not as a manner of speaking. The blood left it the way it leaves faces in moments when the architecture of a person's understanding of themselves and the world around them is, quietly, irrevocably demolished. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, calmly, You might want to call your board. She had been Dr. Adeline Sims's daughter for 61 years. Let me tell you what that meant. Adeline Sims grew up in rural North Carolina in the 1940s, the daughter of a sharecropper who could multiply 6-digit numbers in his head and who told his children every night before they slept that numbers were the one language nobody could take from you. He had not been able to finish school himself. He had watched that door close. He made sure it stayed open for his children. Adeline walked through it. She was a child who noticed patterns in everything, in the way water moved, in the intervals between lightning and thunder, in the geometry of the fields she walked through. She had a teacher in the 8th grade named Mrs. Patterson who recognized what she was looking at and who did what great teachers do. She stayed after school. She wrote letters. She made phone calls. She moved obstacles. Adeline Sims graduated valedictorian. She went to school on a scholarship at a time when the scholarship was the only door open to her, and she walked through that one too. She got a master's. She got a doctorate. She got a teaching position at the only school that offered her one, a small HBCU that could barely afford to pay her, and she taught there for 22 years, and she published when she could, and she was cited by people who did not know her name, and she raised her daughter at a kitchen table that was also a seminar room, and she died too young. There were 3 boxes of her notebooks. Dorothy had all of them. Dorothy had grown up watching her mother solve problems the way other mothers knitted. The same meditative rhythm, the same patience, the same refusal to let a mistake stand uncorrected. She had grown up understanding that a proof was not a performance. It was a truth you located. You didn't invent it, you found it. You cleared away what was false until what was true had nowhere left to hide. She had learned this at a kitchen table. She had carried it through a life that did not always know what to do with it. She had carried it in a brooch that pressed against her collarbone, and in notebooks she read on her lunch break, and in the quiet particular pleasure she took in a floor mopped in clean, even strokes. She had carried it into floor 38 on a morning in March, and she had seen a sign error in a variance model, and she had not said anything, and she had gone home, and she had not slept well, and she had come back, because her mother had taught her one more thing. She had said it once. When Dorothy was 17 and had stayed quiet about something she should have spoken up about, and Adeline Sims had looked at her daughter over the kitchen table and said, "The truth doesn't need your permission to exist, but sometimes it needs your courage to be heard." Dorothy had carried that too. She had carried all of it for 44 years, waiting without knowing she was waiting. For 40 seconds in front of a whiteboard on the 38th floor of a building in Charlotte, North Carolina. Go back to the moment she stepped to the board. Watch her hands. She didn't hesitate, not for a single second, because she had already done this calculation in a break room at noon on a paper napkin, and she had done it correctly the first time. The world learned that over the next 72 hours, the crisis began internally. Elliot Reese, to his full credit, spent the next 3 hours reconstructing the 4 months of Aria's trading history through the corrected model. The numbers that came back were both better and worse than anyone had expected. Better because the fundamental strategy was sound and the loss, while significant, was correctable. Worse because it was now irrefutably clear that the error had been findable from the first week, that it had been there in plain sight, and that 12 credentialed analysts and 2 consulting firms had not found it. The SEC review team spent 6 hours on 38. They were professional and methodical and thorough. Dorothy answered every question they asked. She sat in a chair at the conference table in the strategy room, the same room she had mopped at 5 that morning, and she answered questions with the same voice she used for everything, patient, precise, unrushed. At one point, the lead officer asked her to explain the error in plain language for the record. She said, "When you're building a model that updates itself over time, the sign convention on the feedback term tells the model whether to amplify or dampen its own response to new information. If you get the sign wrong, the model learns from its mistakes in exactly the wrong direction. It becomes more confident precisely when it should become more cautious. You end up with a system that's optimally calibrated for the opposite of the truth." The lead officer said, "And you identified this morning." Dorothy said, "I identified it this morning. I believe I could have identified it months ago if I'd had access to the board." There was a pause. The lead officer wrote something down. Marcus Hale, sitting at the far end of the table with his attorneys flanking him, said nothing. He had not said very much since the board. The first article appeared at 11:47 that night on a financial news site, sourced anonymously, under the headline, "SC Visits Hale Meridian in Surprise ARIA Review." By morning, it had 26,000 shares. By noon the next day, someone had found Gerald Park's cousin, who had not been quite careful enough, and the basic shape of the story was out. A cleaning woman, an error, 40 seconds. The internet received this the way the internet receives the things it was waiting to receive. By 3 in the afternoon, the phrase 40 seconds flat was trending. By 5, there were 700,000 posts. By midnight, the corrected figure was 4.2 million posts, because the story had traveled past the financial media into something larger, into the place where people keep the specific, particular accumulation of every time they have been dismissed before they were heard, every time their credentials were in the wrong format to be recognized, every time someone looked at what they were wearing instead of what they were saying. The phrase sweetheart appeared in 17,000 posts, not the word itself. The word plus the context, the word as a weapon, and then the 40 seconds that had answered it. A journalism student at UNC had a cousin who worked in the Meridian building. The journalism student made one call and got a first-hand account of the morning, including the moment with the eraser, and published it on a personal Substack that no one had ever read. By the following morning, it had been shared by a financial journalist with 400,000 followers, and then by a former SEC commissioner who said it was the most concise illustration she had ever seen of what regulatory reform actually needed to look like in practice. And the Substack went from 0 readers to 2.1 million page views in 18 hours. The eraser. That was the detail. That was the moment everyone stopped on. He had at least erased her work. He had looked her in the eye and erased it, slowly, to make a point. And then 40 seconds later, she had rewritten it, correctly, in front of the SEC. Hale Meridian's board of directors held an emergencies meeting at 7 in the morning on the third day. Marcus Hale submitted his resignation at 11:45, under legal advice, before the board could vote. It was the kind of resignation that is really just a firing with different paperwork. The resignation letter was 14 lines long. It contained the word regrettable 3 times and took personal responsibility for nothing. The board released a statement 60 minutes later that was considerably more direct. They were implementing a full review of the ARIA project. They were commissioning an independent audit of hiring and advancement practices within the Quantitative Strategy Division. They were establishing an anonymous technical review channel, a formal mechanism for any employee at any level to flag a mathematical or structural concern and have it reviewed by an independent committee. The channel was named by unanimous board decision the Sims Review, not for Dorothy, for Adeline. Because when Dorothy had testified to the SEC and again in the internal board deposition, she had said, when asked where her knowledge came from, "My mother taught me. She was a mathematician. Her name was Dr. Adeline Sims. She taught at Caldwell College for 22 years. And one of the board members had looked that name up that night and had read 2 of her published papers and had called 2 other board members, and the 3 of them had sat with the specific weight of it. A woman whose work had circulated uncredited, whose daughter had been invisible on a floor above their office for 9 years. And they had voted, without disagreement, to put her name on the door. Marcus Hale found out about the Sims Review from a news alert on his phone. He was no longer in a position to have opinions about it. The civil component was quieter, but no less consequential. Dorothy did not initially plan to sue. She had a consultation with an employment attorney, arranged by a woman in the compliance department at Meridian who had watched the morning of March 14th from the doorway and had written down what she saw in a memo she kept in her personal files. And the attorney laid out the landscape, and Dorothy listened. And she said she needed a week to think about it. She thought about it in the way she did everything, methodically, without drama, consulting the things that mattered. She talked to Gerald Park. She called her daughter in Atlanta, who was a pediatric nurse and who had her grandmother's eyes and did not mince words. Her daughter said, "Mama, He erased your work in front of witnesses to humiliate you. That's not a gray area. Dorothy filed on a Tuesday. The complaint was 41 pages long and addressed in careful order. Wrongful workplace humiliation, hostile dismissal of a credentialed employee, and direct documented financial harm to the company that was causally connected to the suppression of her input. The damages sought were $500,000, which the employment attorney had set based on a combination of back pay, compensatory damages, and the estimated value of the correction Dorothy had provided. The difference between what the ARIA losses had been and what they would have been. If her observation had been acted upon in February, when she had first seen the error and had not spoken up, partly because men like Marcus Hale had spent 9 years training her that speaking up was not safe. The number was $500,000. The press noticed. CEO bet the cleaner she couldn't solve it, one headline read, not quite accurately but close enough for the internet. She did it in 40 seconds. The case settled in 4 months under seal, for a number the attorney later confirmed was meaningfully above the initial figure. Dorothy released a single statement through the law firm. It was 2 paragraphs. The second paragraph said, "I am grateful for the support of so many people I have never met. My mother always said that the truth doesn't need your permission to exist. I hope this helps a few more doors stay open." It circulated for weeks. The second sentence became a poster. It was printed on a wall in the mathematics department at Caldwell College, in the building that had been renamed, the prior spring, the Adeline Sims Hall of Applied Mathematics. The renaming had been in process for 3 years, stalled by Budget Committee deliberations. After March 14th, the committee meeting took 11 minutes. The audit of Meridian's hiring and advancement practices took 7 months. Its findings, which were released as a public summary under the settlement terms, documented a pattern that surprised no one who had been paying attention. A consistent gap between the credentials of employees in support and maintenance roles and the credentials recognized in their personnel files, a hiring pipeline for quantitative roles that had sourced 91% of its candidates from 4 universities, a formal policy against employees outside the strategy division engaging with work product that had never been reviewed for whether it might systematically exclude people with relevant expertise who had arrived at Meridian through different doors. The policy was rescinded. A new one replaced it, one that included a formal intake process for any employee who wished to flag a technical observation at any level, in any department, with confidentiality protections and a required response timeline. The Sims Review. 3 submissions were filed in the first 2 months. 2 were from maintenance staff. 1 was from a security guard who had noticed a pattern in access log anomalies that turned out to be relevant to a cybersecurity review the firm was already quietly conducting. That finding saved the firm an estimated $800,000 in potential breach-related costs. Nobody called it 40 seconds that time, but the math was not entirely different. 1 year later, in March, Dorothy Sims was not working the early shift at Meridian anymore. She was working 3 days a week, by choice, because she had negotiated a consulting arrangement with the independent audit committee that had been established as part of the settlement. A retainer for what the committee chair described in the contract, with careful legal language, as applied quantitative review services. The hourly rate was the kind of hourly rate that had made her daughter cry quietly on the phone for reasons she called being proud. She still brought her lunch in a brown paper bag when she came in. Old habits. She was also, on the days she wasn't at Meridian, teaching. Gerald Park's son, the Duke graduate student she had helped over the phone that one lunch break, had defended his dissertation in the fall and accepted a postdoctoral position at Caldwell College, which had recently received a significant private endowment for its mathematics department. He had asked Dorothy through his father if she would be willing to come and talk to his students about applied quantitative intuition. He had used that exact phrase, applied quantitative intuition. Dorothy had told Gerald to tell his son she liked that phrase. She went in February, 1 week before the anniversary of March 14th. She sat in front of 22 graduate students in a classroom in Adeline Sims Hall and she put on the whiteboard the exact variance decomposition from the ARIA model, with the error in place, and she asked if anyone could find it. 11 minutes of silence. Then a young woman in the second row, 24, from Greensboro, first in her family to get past an undergraduate degree, raised her hand. She pointed to the third line. Dorothy smiled. She said, "Tell me why." The young woman told her. Dorothy said, "That's right, your grandmother's grandmother would be proud." The young woman blinked. She said, "You didn't know my grandmother." Dorothy said, "I know the kind of woman who teaches a granddaughter to see that. I know her very well." The classroom was quiet. She reached up. She unpinned the brooch from her lapel. She held it for a moment, the small gold oval, the ring of pearl, DAS worn smooth. And she said to the room, not to anyone in particular, "My mother believed that mathematics was a way of seeing, not a tool, a way of seeing. She believed that if you taught people to see clearly, the world got a little more honest. I believe that too." She pinned the brooch back on. She told them about Adeline. She told them about the kitchen table and the notebooks and the classroom with the water stain on the ceiling. She told them about the year her mother spent working through a paper that she published under a name that no one outside her department would recognize, that was cited 17 times, that was acknowledged once at a conference she could not afford to attend by a man who called her work foundational. She told them about the box of notebooks and the way she read them still, and the way that reading them felt like a conversation that hadn't ended. She talked for 40 minutes. When she was done, the young woman from Greensboro raised her hand again and said, "Will you come back?" Dorothy said, "I'll come every month. And if any of you get stuck on something, you have my number now. Use it." She paused. She said, "The door was hard to open. That's true. But it's open. Walk through it. If this story moved something in you, if it settled somewhere it needed to settle, leave a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming. And tell me this, have you ever been in a room where you had the answer and no one would let you give it? I want to know what you did. Tell me in the comments. Because here's what really gets me about all of this. It wasn't the math. The math is extraordinary. And what Dorothy Sims did on that whiteboard in 40 seconds is going to be talked about in business schools for a long time. But that's not what gets me. What gets me is the 9 years. 9 years she came through the service entrance. 9 years she pushed that cart off the service elevator on 38. 9 years she saw the work on those boards and cleaned around it and kept what she knew pressed against her collarbone like something fragile in a crowd. Not because she was hiding, not because she was ashamed, but because the room had made clear in 1,000 small and large ways that the door was not for her, and she came anyway. Every morning, 2 minutes early. That is not a small thing. That is not background detail. That is the whole story. Marcus Hale erased her work to make a point. He made a point, all right. He made it to 4 million people and a federal oversight body and a board of directors and a mathematics department that now bears the name of the woman who taught her daughter to see. You can erase the line. You cannot erase what she knows. Here is my question for you, and I mean it personally. Is there a door in your life that someone told you wasn't for you? And did you walk through it, or are you still standing outside? Because I think a lot of us have been standing outside a door for a long time, holding something real, waiting for permission that was never going to come. Dorothy didn't wait for permission. She waited for courage. There's a difference. Tell me about your door. I'm listening.